Hello everybody and welcome to OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. I'm Jack and today I'm here with Joe and we are going to be talking about the rotation announcement that was announced on Wednesday, I believe. I think it was late Wednesday night. Basically telling us what format we're going to have for 2015 to 2016. There was no surprises really. It was decided that it's going to be XY on, which I think everyone expected, especially after the Lysander's Trump Card ban, because there was a few hints in that piece of news that led to a lot of people to believe that it was going to be XY on. We're losing 5 sets and some pretty influential cards overall. So we're going to go through pretty much every single card that's seen competitive play over the last 2 or 3 years that we're losing, and explain to you what it's going to do to the format really. So Joe, if you want to start with Boundaries Crossed.
Yeah, so Boundaries Crossed is the first to get cut, and the first card we're going to look at is Celebi EX. It wasn't overly played, but it did find niches here and there in decks across its playtime, and basically at the moment we only really see it in Medicham for anyone still playing that deck. So in terms of power creep, Medicham gets a bit worse without Celebi. There's the Stadium that can do it for it, but then it can't play Fighting Stadium, so its output's weaker. Overall, Medicham's already a fringe deck, and losing Celebi is just not great for it. But overall, not too impactful to start us off.
Yeah, the next Pokemon is actually Blastoise, the Deluge Blastoise, which is pretty impactful. When it was played a lot, and it's still sometimes played now that Archie's been released. Archie Blastoise is definitely a deck that has seen a lot of competitive play. I believe it got top 16 at US Nationals, did it not?
Yeah, Heretic.
Yeah, so Blastoise is still seen out and about, but it was in its heyday when it was Blastoise, Keldeo, Black Kyurem EX, and it was pretty much a reprint of the base set Blastoise by the attack. The ability was the exact same. But yeah, we are losing Blastoise, and as well as that, we're losing Keldeo as well, which is one of the main attackers that was in the Blastoise deck, and was probably more commonly used for its rushing ability, because paired with another card we're losing that we'll talk about a little bit later on, Floatstone, it meant that Keldeo could get you out of any sort of status conditions, get you out of a lot of different situations where you're asleep or anything like that, and you'd still be able to attack with the same Pokemon next turn. Rushing letting you put Keldeo from your bench into your active, and then Floatstone letting you retreat for free. It's still seen in a lot of decks today. Especially Metal Mega Rayquaza, the deck really relies on Keldeo just to be able to attach to the bench and still continually hit hard with all of the different attackers it's got. So yeah, Blastoise and Keldeo are definitely huge losses. Keldeo more importantly, because it's just such a versatile card really. There was no one deck that you needed it in, but it was very useful in a lot of the decks that see competitive play really.
Yeah, it was really important as an attacker early on in its life, and then when Floatstone came out, it was just such a clutch tech for a load of things to deal with, just poison, sleep, and like you say, stuff like Bronzong where you need to attach from the bench. The rushing is like perfect for that. So Keldeo is a real huge loss for us in terms of chunkier things. It means we have to play like 3 or 4 switches now in our decks, which is kind of clunkier than just having a repeated use of movement, which is what Keldeo provides. So moving on, we have the Dusknoir leaving us, the Sinister Hand Dusknoir. This has been used in all manner of things, spread damage decks, even like currently people like playing Gourgeist and Noivern and Flygon. It's been in loads of different things. We've seen it with Empoleon and Miltank before. Just being able to move counters all over the board is crazy, crazy good strategy. Even for a stage 2, people made it work, and limiting prizes so that you don't lose to ends, and then just putting all your counters on to win the game in one turn was a good strategy a lot of the time. Also with a Selgor, Trevor, you could force them to permanently be in that lock. So plenty of good reasons why plenty of reasons why it was good, and it's something we're really going to miss.
Yeah, Dusknoir is definitely one of the cards that I'm sad to see go. It was also used in sort of the Empire deck that I know you used to play a lot, Joe, with Empoleon and Miltank, because you just stack up a lot of counters, move them off, and not really take any knockouts till the last turn, or till once you've got enough counters to take 6 knockouts, and then you just take 6 knockouts in a turn, with built-in draw support and so much damage. It was just such a good deck. So yeah, Dusk Noir is definitely sad to see Dusk Noir go. The next card's Mana, another sort of niche card, but we did profile a deck with Rayquaza, Mana, and Virizion EX a couple of months back, where basically you would rely on Mana getting you sleep flips, being protected from the sleep flips yourself because you have the Virizion, and then hitting huge damage with Mega Rayquaza. I don't believe Mana was used too much overall, but that's probably the most notable use of it. And some people did play that when Roaring Skies first came out, because it was definitely a strong strategy, but people have now sort of moved to the Bronzong, more toolboxy type build, with usually using Mega Rays, but also having metal toolbox attackers like Cobalion and Aegislash, things like that, just to be able to use for different situations. But back when Mega Rayquaza was first released, Mana, Virizion, and Mega Ray was definitely I believe a viable strategy for the first few weeks of its release.
Yeah, just because of how big Toad was. And like sometimes you could see it teched in Virgen even for the opening turns against Toad. And even before that, it was just because you have nothing to do really for the first 2 turns for Virgen, and there's no downside to sleeping stuff. It was a tech sometimes. And also, I think I played it in Flygon Dusk Noir like once or twice just to try and buy yourself extra turns now and then.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's just a quirky little tech card, basic Pokemon with a nice ability that we're missing out on. Next up is probably one of the most relevant cards that we have in the format at the moment that's going to be leaving us, and that's Landorus EX. Landorus with his crazy 1 energy attack for 30 and 30. Even that's good, but then you have Fighting Stadium, Muscle Band, Strong Energy. You can go to like 120 total damage in a turn. Considering the active and the bench for 1 energy, that's crazy. Great typing, still great typing. Like when it was first released, it was there to check stuff like Darkrai and those sorts of decks. Now it's dealing with Manectric and stuff like that quite nicely. So just hitting really hard, really fast with the bats most of the time at the moment. And that's going to be a real loss. Seeing as though Lando Bats is probably like a tier 2 deck right now. It underperformed at US Nats just because I think everyone was pretty much prepared for it. Where we saw stuff like Kyogre getting in the top 16, like 2 of those decks. So that's clearly like to auto win against Landy Bats. So it's still a powerful deck, as like Lucario and stuff, but it's definitely losing a lot of power because Landorus is the front man of that deck right now.
Yeah, Landorus was so splashable in anything that sort of any box type decks as well. I know Aroma Box sometimes ran one just because it had so many sort of Prism Energy and Rainbow Energy, and the 30-30 for 1 energy is so efficient. Yeah, Landorus has always been popular. It was one of the most popular cards when Boundary Cross was released, and is still one of the most expensive and popular cards out at the moment. And that's probably it. I think Landorus EX is probably the card I'm most sad to see go, because I've enjoyed playing Landorus. Landorus is a lot of fun. Moving on, another partner for Dusk Noir was Flygon. I think it's Sand Slammer Flygon is his ability, where in between turns you put 1 damage count on each of your each of your opponent's Pokemon, including their bench. So the strategy would be sort of hit with Excelgor, move into a Flygon, and add an extra damage counter to everything, and then manipulate those damage counters with Dusk Noir. I know Ben Patulski played this a couple of years ago, and it was the first time I'd ever seen the deck, and I was just blown away by how interesting this concept was. And ever since, I feel Flygon's got a lot worse since Toad's been out, because everything that's Stage 2 has lost, in essence, the ability to use Rare Candy, because Toad was just so strong. Now Toad's seeing a bit more of a back foot, we may begin to see some more Stage 1 and Stage 2 decks. But unfortunately, I doubt we'll ever see anything with Flygon again that's not in Standard, because I can't see anyone playing it at Worlds, and Toad is still sort of relevant while the bats are about. But yeah, Flygon was definitely a good partner for Dusk Noir, and it was such an interesting card. I think we've only had a couple of those types of card. It usually is on something like a Flygon. I think we had a Level X or something that did it as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's another card that is a unique card that is sad to see go, really.
Yeah, another strange, like, quirky ability which is maybe a little bit worth mentioning, is the Ditto. Ditto was pretty much just used for a tech for Flareon. It allows you to protect your EVs against like Landorus because you stay out of range even with weakness because you have 70 HP, or at least in the early turns, at least force them to have other things. And it means then you can insta-evolve into a Flareon because you can go, if the Ditto's been on the field for a turn, you can go into the Eevee and then the Flareon. So you can sort of protect your board a bit more, have like potentially more EVs on your bench by not physically having them at the time. So that was good, and of course it adds up the numbers for Flareon in terms of damage because it's an extra Pokemon that you can either toss away via Compressor or Ultra Ball, or you can just, when it dies, that's an extra Pokemon for you. So it was a cheeky little card for Flareon at the time, and yeah, it was good.
Yeah, another one that also was seen as a 1 or 2 of in Flareons was Ordino. You would actually discard it from your hand rather than your bench or anything. You discard it from your hand and then heal 10 damage and all status conditions from your active.
One status.
Oh, was it 1 status? Okay. Which would sort of increase Flareon's power again because you're getting more Pokemon in the discard. That was the only real situation that anyone ever saw it in. I don't believe it was used much else. But Ordino was definitely seen as a 1 or 2 of in Flareon as well.
I played 2 of it in Rayquaza in my early testing to deal with Toad. It didn't work out very well. No. But so the final Pokemon for Boundaries Crossed you want to talk about is Terrakion. It got that shiny reprint that was really awesome, and yeah, it was. We've seen it loads. It was a real good check in the early days again for Terrakion. No, for Darkrai. Less and less play as time's gone on, I guess, because it is kind of slow. EXP share became a lot less relevant. I remember it being in a 6 corners based deck, which I loved to play back in the day, just trying to hit type coverage on everything. And Terrakion, it was strong, and I think even if it wasn't rotated, I don't think many people would play it anyway anymore, so it's not too relevant.
No, I believe it was also reprinted in Legendary Treasures, but we thought we'd put it into the Boundaries Cross section because it was where the shiny one was, and I think the shiny one was the best art that it ever had. It looked so good. On to trainers from Boundaries Crossed. We're going to start with Skylar. Now, if you've been paying close attention to any news, Skylar may be getting a reprint in XY8, so we may end up having Skylar again, but for the basis of this video, we're going to presume that Skylar, because we won't get it until at least November, we're going to presume that, English-wise, we're not going to have Skylar for the next few months. Skylar is sort of a trainer that's fluctuated. It depends completely on how you want to play your deck. If you want to play a turbo build, you're not going to be running Skylar, it's just too slow. But if you're playing more of a setup build, especially when sort of stage 2s were still relatively big, Skylar was so good. You could search for the rare candies, the Ultra Balls, anything that you needed. And Skylar sort of filled that missing piece that if you ever needed one of the pieces you needed to sort of build up your strategy quickly, Skylar was always such a good card for doing that. But then with more aggro decks, you would just see sort of 4 Juniper, 4 N, and then 2 or 3 other draw supporters. And Skylar was too slow because you want to be drawing for your turn rather than searching for a specific card, especially if you feel like you're going to get that card off a Sycamore or something and get other cards as well. So yeah, Skylar sort of fluctuated in play. It's still seen today. It's still the situation is completely the same. There's still turbo decks that don't use it. There's still setup decks that do use it. Interestingly, Karina is still in the format, and it's sort of a pseudo Skylar. It can't get you the supporters or stadiums that Skylar could, but it does get you a Pokemon and an item. And a lot of the time you were Skylaring for an item if you weren't. It was either a supporter or item, really. So we do technically still have Karina, but it's a lot more niche because it's mainly used in fighting decks. You're not really going to use it anywhere else, especially as it only gets you a trainer card. But yes, unless, presuming we do get Skylar in XY8, we may still be able to play Skylar around November time. But I believe for now, Skylar is rotating at least for the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, Skylar was like a thing I loved to play a 4 of in when it was early released. Like, if you're playing Blastoise, it was great for the Candy or the Ultra Ball. Even in like Virgin, all you need is energy, so you just find like yourself an energy search. It was just really good, Skylar, and it's just the guaranteed thing that you need at the time. And worst comes to worst, you got dead hand, you just find a supporter for next turn. It was really good. Next up, there's a supporter that we probably wouldn't have mentioned had US Nats not happened, but it's actually Hugh. He had his moment in the spotlight, making his way to the finals of US Nats. I still don't think it's a good supporter, but it had its one niche usage, and I guess that's something Warlord has to deal with now going into the future. It's got a lot to deal with, seeing as though everyone's just going to counter it now. Well, if it stays relevant, people will just counter it, but Hugh was definitely a powerful card for that deck, because having people see the Warlord deck like, oh, they're trying to mill me out, I just won't play any cards. Then you can end up hewing someone for like 6 or 7 or even more than that sometimes, just forcing discards. And if they're holding stuff as well, it can be really painful. So it was a great card in Warlord, but in terms of any other deck that we've seen, Hugh never really got much chance.
Yeah, it was just at the end of its life it was seen. I never really liked Hugh either. It just seemed so sort of, if you could use it, you could use it, but sometimes 5 cards just wasn't enough, especially when you were only drawing up to 5 cards. No one played Bianca, and that was drawing up to 6 cards, so Hugh was never really that relevant. Another trainer is Town Map. Town Map, again, is a deck that is a card that some decks really like and some decks just don't need. It's often used nowadays in Night March, just to be able to see quickly how many Night Marches you've got in the prizes. Town Map is a very sort of, is a card that just helps you in the game more than anything, just because you don't have to prize search. You can rely on knowing exactly what your prizes are quickly. It never, I believe it was used a little bit when it first came out. I know some Virgin players use it as well, just to know how many energy were in the prizes, mainly because energy is so huge in Virgin.
G-Booster.
Yeah, and G-Booster, of course, yeah. But yeah, Town Map's not a huge loss. There's definitely, if you can deck check, you probably wouldn't have run Town Map anyway. But Night March, definitely enjoyed Town Map, just to be able to quickly see how many DCEs, how many Pokemon you've got prized, and be able to get the exact pieces you need to be able to continue your sort of rampage of taking preferably 6 prizes in 3 turns.
Yes, Town Map's an actually really interesting one, because since I've been playing, there's always been some sort of means of either checking your prizes or exchanging a prize. Like, we've seen Azelf, I think we saw Rotom, that was in like Undaunted, I think it was. Yeah. And now Town Map lets you see everything. I think that's the most powerful one we had as well. I guess Azelf gave you immediate access, so kind of powerful in its own right. But it's interesting that we have none of that at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see how they bring that back, be it a Pokemon or a trainer or incorporating it some other way, which would be quite cool to see.
Yeah.
So next up, we'll get onto the first of our A-Specs, probably the most influential A-Spec. Definitely in recent times, like since Lysander's trump card, everyone dropped Dowsing Mech because there was no point. Even with LTC banned, I think Comp Search was probably the most played A-Spec. Just grabbing you anything in your deck, really good. Also having a discard sometimes helped out other decks. So pretty simple, really good card. I think it's the only card that could find DCE other than like Teammates. So had plenty of uses throughout the whole time, its whole lifetime, really.
Yeah, Computer Search is probably one of the most influential trainers we're going to lose. It's just, A-Specs in general. I really hope they eventually bring back the whole A-Spec mechanic, because I think it's such a good mechanic. It meant they could make some really powerful trainers. With the restriction of only having one in the deck, it meant I just think it meant for a lot more consistency in decks. And then things like G-Booster and like Crystal Wall and stuff, it just made unique Pokemon and unique situations. So I really hope eventually they bring the A-Spec mechanic back. But who knows, maybe we'll get it one day. That's it for Boundaries Crossed. That's probably the smallest list of cards that we're losing, but I'd like to say the most influential, just because there's Landorus and Keldeo and Comp. I think Boundaries Crossed is one of the... It's a huge set with the least playable cards, but the most influential cards. It's a really weird set, but yeah, that's definitely a lot of good cards that we're losing. Onto Plasma Storm, and the first card we're going to talk about is Victini EX, which has always been a card that everyone's wanted to use, but a lot of people haven't sort of found the perfect way of using it. It's seen sort of some tournament usage. and again, another respec victory piece, which made it even more unique. But Victini EX never quite took off. With the low HP and the EX sort of downside, I feel it was a little bit too frail to ever be perfect. If it had the XP of a normal, the HP of a normal Pokemon, it may have been a lot better, because in essence you're not going to die in one hit, and you're going to be able to set up your Pokemon with energy. So Victini EX was always sort of a Theorymon card, but never quite took off. But there was always people that were trying to incorporate it. I know Joe loved the card, and it was also really good. It was also used quite a bit when Virgin was big, because it was so good at taking out Virgin pieces, whether it be the Virizion or the Genesect, especially if you had the Victory piece, because you were doing it for no energy as well. So yeah, Victini EX is another card that we're losing, unfortunately.
Yeah, I loved it. I always tried to make it work. I mean, I remember as soon as Plasma Storm came out, I tried it with Lugia to be like Turbo. Didn't really work out as well as I hoped. And then I've tried it again with like anything that's like too slow. I'll try and just see, okay, how does Victini change this sort of board state? Really, Victini was best when Virgin was popular. But as an accelerator, he had his little fun uses as well. It's just giving up those sorts of prizes is just too difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
Next up, there's the Free Flight Zubat. This is obviously one of the reasons why bats are so good. Obviously, bats are still going to remain good, because you obviously just have the one retreating Zubat. But it meant that if you're going second, you can still, like, if you're Landorus or Hawlucha or even Lucario, you can just freely retreat out of your Zubat if you happen to start with it. And then you can get, 60 damage, 100 damage, who knows what, with whatever your fighting type attacker is. Similarly, anything running bats like Seismitoad, it's obviously really painful. Now if you play bats and you don't start with Toad, and you have that Zubat stuck there, that can really suck. Even Manectric, like everything loves pairing itself with bats, because it can get early attacks off, and then the damage comes later, or it adds up with the bats. And having the Free Flight was really, really helpful for all of those decks. So it's slightly weakening the bats in terms of its splash ability, definitely. But the other bats, the Golbat and the Crobat, are still so strong that they're going to still see some play. But the Free Flight really did give it a big boost.
Yeah, it might just mean that the decks that use bats maybe run one or two more switch, if they ran any switch at all, because a lot of the time they wouldn't run any switch, just because, Zubat, Golbat and Crobat all have free retreat. But they may just run a switch and escape rope or anything like that, just something to get out of the active if they do start Zubat. It's not the death of bats by any means. Bats are still good. The splashable damage is so strong, and yeah, it's definitely the ideal starter, but it doesn't mean bats are dead. There's still uses for them. Onto probably the the most influential Pokemon in this set, I think, Donphan. Donphan is just became a monster as soon as Rising Fist was released. All of a sudden, this sort of uncommon that no one had really thought about got so much power. It protected itself. No one really played it when it was first announced or first released. But as soon as it can start hitting for 60, 80, 100 and protecting itself, and then then Robosub was released. It just made the deck so strong. It's still a viable contender today. Donphan Groudon is still a deck that's used quite a bit, and it's still a really good deck. But yeah, Donphan is probably the outright sort of strongest Pokemon that we've got in the Plasma Storm list. And it just sort of snuck up on everybody. No one really expected when it was first released to ever use the card, but then we got so much fighting support in Furious Fists. It meant that this one energy, one prize powerhouse came out that protected itself, and then with things like Life Dew and everything, it just became such a strong deck. And there were so many forms of it as well. There's like Turbo Donphan, there's Donphan Groudon, there's Donphan, and then sort of walls like Aegislash, Sigilyph. There's just so many forms of Donphan. So yeah, it's definitely a very influential card that's shaped the format in one way or another over the past year or so.
Yeah, Donphan was one of these decks that like single-handedly kept others in check. Like, if you can't beat Donphan, you've got to go back to the drawing board, just because it's always going to be in some capacity over the last like 6 months at tournaments just because of how good it is. So yeah, really, really good deck. I still love Donphan Groudon at the moment. I think that's even a good Worlds pick currently. So it's a shame to see him go. I think we lose a couple other hit and switch type Pokemon, and I think the only one we have left in format is Gengar EX. So that's a bit of a shame because I do like that hit and switch strategy, still really strong, and especially with Robosub, it's got to be something we can abuse in the future. Next up, we have Plasma Klinklang. This was seen again. US Nats brought it back with Dylan Bryan, I think it was. A few others played it as well in his team. Klinklang, obviously very strong. Just saying no to all EXs is a great strategy. Kind of slow, kind of clunky. I remember it did well the year before at US. They played both Klinklangs, didn't they? Was it US? Yeah.
It was. I think it was 2 years ago now. I think
2 years ago.
I think so. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was the black and white Klinklang, wasn't it? And this other one was new. I think.
So yeah.
So it's been around quite a bit. It's only just cropped back or just resurfaced, just because I guess it fell off the map a little bit. People were too scared of Toad, really, thinking you're never going to set this big thing up, and if you do, it'll just be catch a target. But it didn't stop Dylan from playing it, and obviously it's still pretty useful. We lose quite a lot of the safeguarding type stuff, not many left in format at all, just the Beautifly I think we have, so it's interesting to see those fade out of existence.
Yeah. Next up, another Metal Pokemon, Cobalion EX. A card that on release I really liked. It then sort of, for me, underwhelmed a little bit. I expected it to be good in its own right, but it was seen more of a tech Pokemon, especially for Seismitoad. Just getting rid of their DCEs was so strong. Nowadays it's seen with Bronzong, which is the ideal place for it. You can set it up in a turn, you can set up the Silver Bullet in a turn, or you can start with it and stall your opponent because so much special energy is being played at the moment. You can start with it, it's a fine starter, and you can knock off their energy while setting up behind it because it's only one energy for the attack. Yeah, I was underwhelmed by it a little bit when it was first released, but I now really like the card. And it's definitely earned its place in sort of Bronzong Rayquaza, but Bronzong decks in general, just because it's so versatile in being able to knock off energy and then getting through Safeguard and killing Safeguarders with the Steel Bullet attack. But like we say, we're losing a lot of the Safeguarders as well, so it's sort of the whole block of them are all going at once.
Yeah, I like Cobalion. Even when people were playing it in like big basics with like Garbodor and Mewtwo, just to counter other people playing like big basics, it was just a fun deck. A good card, Cobalion EX. Serving two purposes in one is obviously a nice reason to just shove it in as like a one-of here and there. So, nice card. Next up, we'll have the old big hitter himself, Black Kyurem EX, hitting 200, absurd amount of damage before Megas were released, just wiping out everything in its path. Obviously, combined with Blastoise and Keldeo, this was huge. Back in the day, it pretty much run rampant around tournaments, always top 8ing just because it was so consistent, if not going deeper into tournaments. So much so that stuff like Druddigon and stuff started to get played for DCE, just return KOing. Black Kyurem really sort of dropped off the map a little bit with Toad, just because without Blastoise being as consistent, obviously losing Tropical Beach made it a lot worse, making the deck overall worse, so Black Kyurem didn't see as much Pele, just because the amount of energy he needs to attack. Every now and then he'd crop up in a Manectric deck if someone was brave enough to play it, but it pretty much faded out of existence along with Blastoise.
Yeah, Black Kyurem was such a strong card for a time. Like, people were... Flashfire was such a small set. People were just hunting pretty much solely for Druddigons just because of how big Black Kyurem was, because at the time we didn't have Seismitoad either. And Blastoise was definitely one of the strongest Blastoise was definitely one of the strongest decks, in the format, just because, like Joe said, it was so consistent, such high damage. But Druddigon sort of checked it a little bit, and then, again, like Joe said, Seismitoad checked it even more, and it meant that Blastoise players couldn't get their superior energy retrievals back, or use them getting their energy back. They couldn't use Rare Candy, they couldn't use Ultra Balls. All of a sudden, the deck became so much less consistent, and Black Kyurem just sort of faded out, like Joe said, out of existence, and isn't really seen much at all anymore. The next card, another plasma card, other than Plasma Clang, is Snorlax. It's not EX, just regular Snorlax with the block ability. Another sort of hit and switch target which you could switch into and disrupt your opponent. You'd ideally, it was whilst Catcher was nerfed, but then Lysander was released. You'd Lysander into something that they didn't want active, then block it. And just sort of poke them until they died, leaving Snorlax active after you'd hit and switch with each one. I also believe there was like a Snorlax-based attacking deck, which you'd get 6 Plasma Pokemon out and do pretty much 180 damage. I think it was a 5 energy attack, but you could do 180 damage on a non-EX, which was really strong. So yeah, Snorlax has definitely seen play. Again, another card that's seen less and less play as we've got better hit and switches. Like Robosub, rather than not letting your opponent switch, just doesn't give your opponent a prize, which I feel is a little bit better than not letting them switch, because there are still switching cards, and Snorlax only had 130 HP, I believe, and was weak to fighting, so Landorus could eventually quite easily knock it out. But yeah, Snorlax is another card that saw some competitive play at least.
I really love Snorlax. He was clutch for me when I played Palkia. It was like a really cool soft lock. It really hurt Blastoise at the time, so he was cool just as a wall. He was played in Yeti decks, so basically you start setting up Lugia. Once you get a few attacks off, you scramble into a Snorlax to either close out your game or just give up 1 prize in the process of taking 2 of your own. Snorlax, very, very strong card. It was even played in Juniors, US Nats to top 8, I think it was. Maybe even top 4 until it did get taken out by a fighting deck, Landorus Bats, I think it was. So Snorlax, still fun. It was more like a Storly build where you just played lasers to try and take your prizes, but plenty of avenues for Snorlax, and it's a shame to see such a cool card go. Next up, let's talk about another Plasma Pokemon, Lugia EX, pretty much the king of Plasma. Being able to take extra prizes with the Overflow ability. We see it now with the Delta Plus trait in a few cards. Nothing as powerful as Lugia EX, though, other than maybe the Dragonite, I guess, but that's just really incredible to set up. Whereas Lugia was pretty achievable with stuff like Thundurus and Colress Mech. You could get Lugia set up in a couple of turns and really start doing good damage, as well as taking extra prizes, trying to close out games, killing like 2 EXs to win. Very, very good card. Pretty much fell off the map along with the rest of Plasma just because of fighting decks. Landorus killing Thundurus too easily, and then having other checks for Lugia. Oh my god, my voice is going crazy. No, Jack, you just talk. Let me get some water.
Alright, no problem. The next card we'll go on to trainers is Bicycle. Bicycle is sort of another card that, along with Acrobike and Roller Skates, is other than a supporter draw support. It was another card that a lot of turbo decks used. Again, Lugia often used Bicycle just to be able to quickly draw through their deck and be able to find the Colress machines and DCEs that they needed. Bicycle again has sort of seen less and less play. Night March is probably the most recent use for it. But yeah, as Toad came out, it's another card that sort of saw less and less play because Toad locked the Bicycle out of play. And drawing up to 4 wasn't always as useful as using your supporter for the turn. So Bicycle is another card that sort of fluctuated. I feel Acrobike personally is better, but it's depending on the deck. I feel Acrobike's better, but Bicycle is seen a lot less in general. There's only 1 or 2 decks that I could see it used in, just because space is so tight at the moment in a lot of decks, just with stadiums and sort of support Pokemon. Bicycle sort of didn't make the cut in a lot of these decks.
Yeah, Bike was one of the first in a long line of trainer-based draw, and at the start of its life cycle, so to speak, it was doing quite nicely as like pseudo supporters, trying to keep you fast. It comboed sometimes with Skylar as well, just playing 1 in the deck so that you had some draw in your deck via the Skylar. If you just had a dead hand, it would be like an end-proofing method. So Bike was good in the early early times, but we're not really going to miss it too much just because we have so much already in an abundance with skates, acrobike, like you say. Even compressor can be seen as like a drawing mechanism with VS Seeker, so plenty of different stuff we have to replace bicycle.
And of course,
that rotates.
Shaman.
Shaman.
It's just a better bicycle in general, really, because it's drawing up 6 instead of 4. So yeah, bicycle's just sort of seen less and less play, and has been when it was first released was such a influential card, and a lot of decks wanted to play 2 or 3 of it just because the non-supporter draw support was really good. But we've now got so many better options. It's seen a lot less play lately. And it's only real turbo decks that need a lot of draw in a turn, that only run 2 or 3 supporters and just rely solely on trainer draw, that are ever going to use bicycle anymore.
Yeah. So next up, let's talk about Colrus. Colrus was always sort of fairly mediocre, sometimes a strong supporter card. Getting you up to 10 is obviously a big reward back in the day, and now you can go up to 16. It's kind of crazy. Colrus got way out of control with Skyfield. Very, very powerful. Ended up being almost a 2 of in every deck. I think in the top 8 for US, everyone played 2. At least everyone played 1. Really, really strong card. And the risk of drawing it early and only getting 3 or 4 was so okay, because there's the chance of getting 16 at some point. With VS Seeker combination, you can sometimes get multiple hands of 16, which is just unheard of amounts of cards. For draw power, so really, really powerful. We're losing a lot of supporters, really. We're not left with many draw supporters at all, XY on, and Colrus will be sorely missed because that thing can draw like crazy right now.
Yeah, I never, when it was first released, I didn't really like Colrus, but now, now Skyfield's such a popular stadium, Colrus is definitely like a 2, like Joe said, a 2 of inclusion in most decks, if not all decks, just because it's so much better than most of the other draw supporters in a lot of situations. Onto Colrus Mech, another sort of niche use, in that it only worked for Plasma Pokemon, letting you search for a Plasma Energy from your deck and attach it to one of your Plasma Pokemon. Mainly seen in Turbo Lugia and Virgin, just to be able to meet, be able to hit a turn quicker. Lugia EX could actually get set up in one turn with the use of Colrus Mech, so it definitely was a good inclusion in Lugia. But then with Genesect, it meant that you could chain G boosters. You could G booster once, then attach the grass, and G booster again, or in combination with Energy Switch as well. There's just so many. It just gave so much versatility to any Plasma deck that was already running Plasma Energy, which Genesect was, just to be able to use Red Signal. So yeah, it just gave so much versatility, letting you chain G-boosters, letting you even just chain Megalo Cannons if you had a Genesect die the turn before. You could theoretically get 2 or 3 energy attached in a turn with the use of Colrus Mech and Energy Switch. So yeah, it's definitely, whilst a niche use and only letting it be used by Plasma Pokemon, Colrus Mech is definitely a key card for a lot of the Plasma decks, just because the extra energy attachment was so strong, especially as there wasn't many attacks that, most Plasma attacks also used colourless energy anyway. It meant that you were probably going to run some amount of Plasma Energy and Colrus Mech in some form in a lot of Plasma decks just for the extra sort of acceleration.
Yeah, trainer-based Excel is always going to be good. I think everything that has been trainer-based acceleration, other than Ether, has been really playable, so missing Colrus Mech, obviously all the Plasma stuff's gone anyway, but getting some more trainer-based acceleration would be quite good in the upcoming sets. Next up is Eviolite. We don't really need to touch on this too much because we have Hard Charm, so we're not really missing much, but back in the day, Eviolite was the real king. Even when you're having Outrage Dragon Wars, and you have stuff again, the 6 corners based deck, when you have just things with too much HP to one-hit anything else, Eviolite was really, really clutch for those big HP non-EX Pokemon before EXs started taking over the black and white format. But yeah, we have Hard Charm now, so we're not really missing out.
Yeah, Hard Charm is just a better card, so Eviolite hasn't been seen play in a year and a half now, but at the time it was a very influential card, and Also, we didn't have any. Well, we had Silver Bangle, but we didn't really have a form of Muscle Band. So there was the defense, but there wasn't there sort of the offense, which meant for a lot more tanky decks. And like Joe said, 6 corners, despite them only having sort of 110 HP, there was no way you would one-shotting or sometimes even two-shotting when they had an Eviolite, just because you're reducing damage each time. Probably one of the biggest losses is the Laser Verbank engine. Hypnotoxic Laser and Verbank are both being lost in Plasma Storm, which some may say is a godsend, some may say they wish they stayed. In some capacity, I kind of wish they stayed, but I'm overall quite glad that they're going, just because Seismitoad abused them so much. It's obviously been helped with the loss of, well, the banning of Trump Card. Laser is a lot less influential, but they were so strong for a time. Especially the sometimes sleep as well. Whilst there was only a 25% chance you were going to stay asleep, that 25% could sort of mean you a win or a loss. If you stayed asleep for just one turn too many, all of a sudden your opponent's ahead on prizes, and there's nothing you can do because they've taken out probably an influential piece of your board. So yeah, Laser Verbank is definitely a big loss. I'm more glad about Laser going than Verbank. I kind of wish Verbank was still in the format just because there's still uses for it. I think Laser was the broken part about the combo, not the Verbank. Because there's so much Stadium Wars at the moment. Verbank isn't dead set on always being in play, but the fact that Laser could sleep as well, I think that's what made the card broken in some people's opinion. But with Verbank, you could still pair it with other Pokemon that poison, like Toxicroak and stuff. There's just, I feel Verbank as a card wasn't bad. It was the Laser that was paired with the Verbank that caused so much disruption and, well, caused for a distaste in the whole game for the past two or 3 years.
Yeah, I don't necessarily dislike it, but I'm definitely happy that it's going. Like, I obviously accept that it's been in format. It just means that in future there's going to be decks like Toad that could compensate for its lack of output with Laser Bank. My voice is going again. And Jesus. Basically, we're going back to either you choose to have a hard-hitting deck or you choose to have a less hard-hitting deck. And Laser really just let weak damage output decks still do well because you keep up with damage anyway with Laser and you just play disruption cards. So it's good to see that rebalance.
Yeah. Onto the aspects of Plasma Storm. Dowsing Mech is sort of the opposite of Comp. Rather than searching through the deck, it searched through the discard for a trainer. Like Joe said, as soon as Trump was released, Dowsing Mech saw no play whatsoever, just because Trump did, in general, what Dowsing Mech was going to do. And again with VS Seeker, a lot of the time you were using Dowsing Mech for a supporter. VS Seeker just did that for you. So yeah, Dowsing Machine is going. It was used, on release, it was used, you either played Comp Search or Dowsing Mech, really. We didn't touch on Gold Potion, but there was also Gold Potion in Boundaries Cross, but no one really played that. So it was either Dowsing Machine or Comp Search, or unless you had a specific strategy that used Scramble Switch, which I'll talk about in a minute, you were either going to play one or the other. So on release, Dowsing Machine was probably debatably as good as Computer Search, but it slowly got worse over time, just because there's more ways of getting stuff out of the discard, whether it be Trump or VS Seeker. I know a couple of people since Trump's ban have been playing Dowsing Machine again, which is completely fine. It's understandable because it's still a relatively good ace spec, but the Trump ban was so close to the remaining nationals, like US nationals and stuff. I believe people were sort of set in their ways with Comp Search. They knew what they were doing when they had a Comp Search in deck. They knew they could search for anything. Dowsing Machine, whilst reading incredibly similar, it was such a different strategy. I think a lot of people were happy with the Comp Search in their deck, didn't really feel the Dowsing Machine was justified, and therefore wanted to keep the Comp Search in overall, even after Trump was banned. So yeah, I think as times evolved, Comp has become the better of the two, but on release, Dowsing Machine was definitely good.
Yeah, I think I remember Dowsing Machine being most prominent in like Yveltal Garbodor builds and stuff like that. Like anything with Garbodor liked having the utility of Dowsing Mech, just because they played techie supporters and sometimes grabbing like your extra float stone or something like that. Dowsing Mech definitely did have its purposes and probably the second strongest A spec we've seen. Next up, Scramble Switch, a really cool A spec, allowing you to move all your energy along with shifting from the bench to the active. That's really, really awesome. It worked well with the Yeti deck that we've spoken about. It's worked well with a bunch of different decks. Even Groudon liked to play it in the most recent times, moving from one Groudon to another, and essentially your opponent can't access that benched Groudon because of the barrier. So essentially they've got 200 damage sat on them, but your opponent can never take those two prizes unless they're playing something like Bats. So Scramble Switch, really, really powerful. Obviously, it meant that you couldn't play Comp Search or Dowsing Machine, so there's the consistency aspect of risk-reward. How many times am I going to get the perfect Scramble Switch off? Maybe have to Juniper it in the opening hand, which really sucks. Then I just lose my A-Spec. But that high-risk, high-reward thing where you can get into a position, a fresh Pokemon with now 4 or 5 energy on it, being able to hit its biggest attack, probably just taking knockouts here and there. Scramble Switch really did have its uses, and I really like that card.
Yeah, I think Scramble Switch was the most unique out of all of the different A-Specs. We had Healing, we had Search, we had Draw from the Discard. But Scramble Switch in general was the most unique, because I don't believe there's anything that's really been reprinted like it. Well, really been printed before that's like it. There may have been a couple of older cards. But, yeah, Scramble Switch was personally my favourite A-Spec, just for when I got to use it, because it could develop some really interesting situations which your opponent wasn't expecting at all. The final card of Plasma Storm is the Golden Random Receiver, another card that's sort of fluctuated through the past 2 or 3 years that it's been released. I believe this is the 3rd year that Random Receiver is illegal, and it's finally going. Initially, Random Receiver was used quite a lot because a lot of the time we didn't have all we had was draw support, so you were always going to be getting into a draw supporter. Then things like Skylar and Colress were released, where you don't want to be drawing Skylar or Colress off of a Random Receiver, because more often than not, you're going to want to be drawing rather than searching for a card. And then eventually VS Seeker was printed, which I believe in general is just a better Random Receiver, especially with the fact that we've got Battle Compressor as well. It meant that you could get 3 random supporters into the discard, and then all of a sudden you've got your 4 VS Seeker online, using whatever you want. You could get like a Sycamore, an N, and then like a Lysander or something, and all of a sudden you've got 4 more copies of each of those for you to use. So Random Receiver's seen a lot less play over time. I know some players still do play it. Say if you're only running like 1 Lysander but maybe 4 Sycamore, Random Receiver is definitely still justifiable. But the fact that there are a lot more sort of support accounts around 13 to 15 rather than 4 to 5, Random Receiver's a lot worse with the amount of non-draw supporters we use now. Things like Teammates, you're not going to be wanting to get, like Lysander. You just don't want these off a Random Receiver, you want a draw supporter. So that's why Random Receiver's seen a lot less play. But it will still be sad to see it go, because it's definitely better than things like X-Transceiver, which actually, X-Transceiver's gone. But Palpad, it's definitely not as good as, definitely better than Palpad. So, and always being able to search for supporters is a big thing, just because supporters are so strong. But yeah, so Random Receiver is finally going after its 3 or 4 year lifespan in the TCG.
Yeah, it had a good run. So that's wrapping it up for Storm. Let's go on to Plasma Freeze. The first one we're going to talk about is Execute. Execute with that propagation ability. So beautiful, so good. Even in modern day, it was used for stuff like Rayquaza. Sometimes Raichu like to play it as well, so that if Skyfield goes, who cares, I can propagate back my Pokemon when I find the stadium again and refill that cost for my attack, or to at least increase the output. We've seen it as just discard fodder for most of its life, Ultra Balling away for free, using it for Diving Draw for free. Weavile even loves to play it to get its output every turn. And of course we've seen it with Exeggutor as well, actually being able to attack with Exeggutor with a blockade attack, just a colourless energy. Only 20 damage, but your opponent can't play supporters. and that's pretty powerful as well. And being able to like Compressor for 3 execute to essentially be a Pokemon collector of old days, getting 3 basics, and then you can propagate them all back to the hand to then rebench. It was crazy good just for a trainer card as well. So that combination was brutal. Exeggutor was a brutal deck if you didn't have the hand to deal with it, and the combination of the two going is really going to reshape the format in a good way, I think. Obviously, Exeggutor got worse when Shaman came out, and we have a lot of trainer-based draw anyway with like Trainer's Mail, whatever else, Acrobike. So Exeggcute was played in loads of different things, and Exeggutor was a powerhouse for a very short while. But 2 real big losses from us.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how, with the new Vileplume that comes out, how Exeggutor survives and expanded. Because I know a lot of people are hyping Exeggutor Vileplume just because you completely lock down your opponent. And they can't use supporters or trainers. That means they're relying on Shaman. The reason why Shaman sort of phased Exeggutor out is the fact that you could Ultra Ball for it, but then you can't Ultra Ball for them, so you need them in hand. But then you can't play so many cards in your hand that you're not going to be drawing anything. So all of a sudden, your whole deck's shut down. So yeah, definitely watch out for Exeggutor. It's not quite dead in Expanded, but as far as Standard is going, I'm very glad to see Exeggutor gone. I did not like the deck at all. Onto the evolutions. Leafeon first. I believe it's probably the better of the two. Flareon is good, but I believe Leafeon is so much more versatile. It being sort of splashable in pretty much anything. A lot of the time it was played with Raichu, as of late at least. Being able to deal with anything. It's a good check for Seismitoad, it's a good check for Groudon, it's a good check for Kyogre, especially as Groudon and Kyogre both use 4 energy to attack. All of a sudden you're taking 160 for 1 energy on a non-EX. It's just so strong. But Leafeon's always been good. Even in Flareon, Leafeon was probably one of your main attackers early game while your opponent's setting up, and then Flareon would come in and just do big damage at the end, taking out one shots on the X's, one shots on the X's from full HP. But even if Leafeon had just sort of peppered them up a little bit, 40 to 60 damage, just making the knockout on Flareon a little bit easier. So yeah, Leafeon and Flareon are definitely, it's definitely sad to see them both go. I know Flareon has technically been reprinted in Vespiquen, but Flareon, the old Plasma Flareon, has now gone. Flareon's always been relatively relevant, depending on how the format is. Unfortunately, at the moment, Flareon is a sticky choice because the format is so wide open. There's so many decks being played at the moment. But when there were sort of 2 or 3 archetypes that were always good, Flareon could adapt the deck list to be able to take on all 3 of those archetypes and take wins in tournaments just from being able to deal with the 2 or 3 popular decks at the time. Just because the list was so versatile, as long as you had like a relatively thick Flareon count and some space for other Pokemon. If there was Yveltals, you'd play Raichu. If there was a lot of abilities, you'd play Garbodor. There's just so many different things you could do. If there's a lot of special energy, you play Drifblim. There's so many different things that you could do with Flareon, and especially with the fact that it required a lot of Pokemon to be able to do high damage. It meant you were sort of encouraged to use a very techy Pokemon list, which could deal with a lot of different matchups in a lot of different ways, because you could just get rid of everything that you didn't want for that specific matchup, build up Flareon's power, pepper things with Leafeon and your whatever attacker that is good for that matchup, and then take huge knockouts at the end for on a 1 prize stage 1 Flareon for a DCE, which you could set up in a turn. Flareon's definitely going to be missed.
Yeah, I personally, they're both like a pet love of mine. I've played Flareon since like Flareon became a thing. Like probably even before that, I was playing Flareon. The Leafeon back in the day was for like Blastoise and Keldeo, served such a good role. You could play balloons to deal with Plasma and Virgin and all that good stuff. Flareon coming in for just a DC and clearing up EXs was just crazy good. The whole deck worked on 1 or 2 energy attackers basically, and it was really fun. And then it evolved to having Archie involved with Empoleon trying to cover, like, keep you drawing throughout the day, and also to deal with Landorus really effectively. I think the reason Leafeon's sort of dipped right now is because the amount of bats people are playing. Landorus bats is a tough matchup. Also, even Raichu bats, it hits just as quickly, but it has the bat drops, which Ferron can't really fit in, surprisingly, because although there's a lot of Pokemon that you'd be putting in your deck, all of those Pokemon stay on your field, and that doesn't really work with Leafeon. So, two really good cards. I'm slightly less hurt thanks to the fact that we're getting Vespiquen, pretty much an upgraded Leafeon, because it has better typing and it has free retreat, which is crazy good, and it has level ball. So I can't be too bitter about Leafeon going, but if we didn't see the Vespiquen, I would probably be having a breakdown on camera right now. So next up for Plasma Freeze, we'll have the Electrode. This was the one that can draw you up to 4 cards, magnetic draw, like a mini magnetic draw, the ability, based on the Magnezone Prime that we used to have that could get 6. This was a stage 1 that could get you up to 4 cards. This was normally seen as like a 1-1 of in terms of Blastoise. Other Rain Dance decks, even like Emboar, like to play it. Just to help you end-proof yourself. Obviously, end's going now, so that's another thing we need to discuss. But Electrode, end-proofing yourself, making sure you can keep drawing into the things you like, giving you late-game consistency. It was a very good 1-1 of in those sorts of decks, because you always need to sort of dig for more cards throughout the whole game, and Electrode helps you do that.
Yeah. The next card on the list is actually Plasma Kyurem. Another bunch of Plasma Pokemon are just about to be rotated out in Plasma Freeze, and Kyurem is probably my favourite out of all of them, especially out of this set, just because it's still seen today and it's such a strong attacker. Whilst it's not as good as Landorus EX's 30-30 because it's 1 extra energy, you have Colress Machine, and you have sort of Deluge, and Deoxys as well, which increases its damage. I think Plasma Kyurem is my favourite out of the Plasma cards, and it's still seen today sometimes in sort of Primal Kyogre. I know there's so many different water attackers you can use in Primal Kyogre, and I still feel Plasma Kyurem is definitely a viable one. 120 for 3 is strong, the 30-30 snipe is strong, especially when you're not even attaching from your hand a lot of the time, you're just moving off from moving off from an active Primal Kyogre onto the Plasma Kyurem. It's definitely going to be I'm just definitely going to be sad to see this one go. As far as Plasma Pokemon go, at least, because I think it had the most versatility, and for only 1 prize, it was such an influential card, especially when it came out, being a huge part of TDK.
Yeah, when it first came out, that HP was still really big, and TDK having the type coverage, Thundurus obviously weak to the fighting types, and then Kyurem would just come in swinging if someone wanted to kill the Thundurus in a hurry. Very, very quick output, a lot of damage that can come out, and it's hard to hit 130, at least it was back then. So most of the time Kyurem was pretty safe to get 1 or 2 hits off to take plenty of prizes. With the release of Plasma Freeze, I think that's when Plasma really got huge. Obviously Deoxys increasing the output was important, but Plasma Kyurem was normally the big hitter, either that or Lugia, so it was definitely a good card. So next up, we'll keep on the Plasma train. Thundurus EX, the accelerator of all of the Plasma Pokemon, 1 energy, hitting for 30 for a lightning, helping you accelerate from the discard pile, which is fantastic as we know, through an attack as well, which is great. And of course that 30 damage could be boosted if you're running hot and you find 2 or 3 Plasma Ball, you can start finding your Deoxys pieces to increase that output. Lightning type, it's still pretty influential type, although we don't see much Plasma anymore. Lightning is still a good type to be, and it pretty much remained relevant up until recently. So Thundurus was a real piece of the puzzle for the Plasma decks. Yeah,
and the final piece of that puzzle was usually Deoxys, being able to increase both Thundurus and Plasma Kyurem's output. It just meant the deck all of a sudden went from a relatively mediocre standard Pokemon deck to one that did huge numbers for little energy, and had built-in acceleration with Thundurus, and had sniping. It meant like nowhere on the board was safe. This was also when Catcher was still as good as Lysander is now, so you could really manipulate your opponent's board and take sort of multiple prizes at once with Plasma Kyurem, you'd make sure they took a huge chunk of damage, maybe with Blizzard Burn or another attack, and then you'd capture up something else and maybe snipe something on the bench and hit something else for the active. So yeah, Deoxys is the final of the three, the three Plasma Pokemon in TDK that was so strong that we haven't already covered. And Deoxys also helped with Lugia. It meant it turned Lugia from a 120 attack into potentially, with eventually when Muscle Bound was released, a 180 attack. It could knock out AXs in one turn for three prizes. Lugia was a very strong or a very strong concept, at least for a while. Unfortunately, in practice, it was nowhere near as consistent as it needed to be. But it definitely got off the huge attacks very quickly a lot of the time. Nowadays, Deoxys isn't really seen at all. The most common use for it, I guess, is sort of Plasma Evolutions. That's the only real Plasma deck that's seen, Plasma Soul deck that's seen nowadays. Like I say, Plasma Kyurem is still seen in Primal Kyogre sometimes, but as a Plasma deck, the only deck you're going to find Deoxys in is probably Plasma Evolutions now, and even so, that's not seen very much at all.
Yeah, very fringe. I think most of the Plasmas have rotated themselves out of the format before the actual rotation. Next up, there's a card that's still very relevant in our format, and that's Mr. Mime. He's been relevant. Seeing as though Landorus was released in Boundaries Crossed, Mr. Mime has always been around whenever that gets too strong. Also, TDK love to snipe. There's plenty of things in our format at the moment that loves to snipe, and Mr. Mime is like a perfect one-off inclusion to keep those sorts of decks in check. We're, of course, losing Mr. Mime, which is a real shame. We have the Stadium to stop it, but again, that can be bounced, and you probably have to play more than one of it if you want to deal with sniping decks. So it's a real shame to see Mr. Mime go. He fills a real good niche in most decks, and he can easily be thrown in as a one-of and buy yourself a turn or two against these snipers.
Yeah, Mr. Mime there's always been a use for Mr. Mime, especially like Joe said, if Landorus is getting too strong, you pop in a Mr. Mime and all of a sudden Landorus is only doing 30 damage on the active when it didn't have all of its tools from Furious Fists. It was a relatively good check for Landorus, in all honesty. Next up, a card that Joe touched on earlier on, Weavile. Along with Execute, Weavile Execute was a very low tier but very fun deck. Basically, Weavile would discard a set amount of Pokemon from your hand and do 30 damage times the number of Pokemon you discarded. So you get rid of 4 Executes, then next turn you put them all back in your hand with Propagation and discard them all again and do it and rinse and repeat, doing 120 damage for one. I think it was it 1 energy or 2 energy?
2.
For 2 energy, you could do 120 damage on a non-EX, and sort of consistently be able to keep up Weaviles. It was never seen too much, but a lot of people tried it. It's definitely a fun deck, and I know it's seen some play. When it was first released, it was when it was most popular. Now we have things like Megas that you have to 2-shot with 4 Executes. It's just nowhere near as useful anymore. But when there were a lot of stage 1s and basics around, like things like the Outrage and stuff, you could, with Muscle Bands, you could one-shot them with Weaviles, things like that. It's never seen huge amounts of play, but it's definitely an interesting card, and one that will be, I'll miss it, definitely.
Yeah, it was a fun glass cannon deck. There's a few of those around that always pop up here and there, and when you could have Colress Mech or Dark Patch, it was quite easy to set up multiple of them. At least, you wouldn't fizzle after the first couple of turns, but maybe, if you've not won the game in the first, 6 turns, you probably lose. But, yeah, with the ability, with the Lopunny that we have in Flashfire as well, it did have a slight Breath of Life. I remember it. It either won, a Cities, or, at least top cut a Regionals or a Cities, something like that.
Yeah.
With the Lopunny being able to bounce back into the hand to do big damage. So it's been a fun thing for anyone brave enough to play it, but never too clutch, really. Next up, we'll briefly touch on Cofagrigus. This is the thing that can put 3 damage counters on the board and then kill itself. This was paired with Flareon quite nicely to give you a bit of extra sniping, potentially. Also, it meant that not only do you put 3 counters on the board, but you get an extra 2 counters for the actual Vengeance itself. So it's a plus power for 5, which is pretty cool, but you do give up a prize in the process, so It's kind of high risk, high reward, but Cofagrigus did really speed up Flareon. This was before Battle Compressor, so it was a real good way of turboing your means of discarding Pokemon. So it was a fun thing for Flareon in the early days while it was still teething.
Yeah. Then we've got another Plasma Pokemon, Absol. Absol is another Pokemon that's sort of fluctuated in and out of play. Sometimes it's seen in Plasma decks, sometimes it's seen in Dark decks, sometimes it's seen, well, in its own right with just sort of baby Yveltals. Sometimes no one plays it at all. But Absol was definitely a good non-EX attacker. For 2 energy, you could do up to 100 damage. It did 20 damage for each Pokemon on your opponent's bench. So you'd let them set up, you then drop the Absol, attach an energy, Dark Patch it, and all of a sudden you're doing 100 foot out of nowhere that your opponent wasn't expecting. And again, a non-EX, so really good at prize trading. Absol had its heyday. Now we've got things like Yveltal. Yveltal does, I believe Yveltal does what Absol did, but a lot better, because people have to have energy, whereas they don't have to have a big bench. And with Yveltal, you can build up your own damage rather than relying on them having a big bench. Obviously, with Yveltal, you're giving up 2 prizes, and you're weak to other Yveltals, etc. But I think Absol's sort of seen less and less play as Yveltal's fluctuated the format overall.
Yeah, Absol's been a nice little 1 or 2 of tech in these dark-based decks. When Patch was around, it was nice for just springing out of nowhere. And most recently, it was in the Yveltal Bats build as like a 1 or 2 of for a big swing. Especially being good against stuff like Raichu and Rayquaza, because that output just gets huge. But never really overly played. Next up, let's talk about the Latios that we have. Or we did have, I guess. This was the one with the ability that actually stopped anything else with an ability from damaging it. And this wasn't seen too much, I guess. Like, this was always, you know, in and around in these sort of stally decks. Never really had the attack to boot, really. It did have potential, but its attack was just too poor. Stopping stuff with abilities was good. I think the main attacker with an ability at the time was actually Genesect anyway, and they could just G-Booster through you. So it kind of didn't really fit the purpose that it was meant to. But again, that was at the time when Plasma was big. They didn't have abilities. Virgin, like I say, and also Blastoise was huge. So none of these were too important for Latios. So it never really got kick-started. But every now and then, you could see someone walling with a Latios, and it would really stump certain decks.
Yeah. I believe you're talking about Latias there. Latios was the one that did...
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Latios is the one that a lot of people sort of initially played the new Latios, released in Roaring Skies, with attacking turn 1. But then they realised that the old Latios that was released in Plasma Freeze actually had a really good attack, 150 for 3 energy. You were already running Double Dragon, so it was technically 2 energy. And with the 150, you could sort of take a huge chunk out of an EX or knock out one that's already been damaged just to take the last 2 prizes. So decks, Latios decks usually moved from a 3 of the really speedy hit turn 1/1 to more of a 2-1 split, or even a 1-2 split in favour of the old Latios in Plasma Freeze, just for versatility and being able to hit huge damage later on. It's never seen much play other than that. The same with the Latias. The attack's good, but it's never been groundbreaking, and it never quite reached perhaps the potential that Pokemon wanted it to. But they both had really interesting sort of different things about them, whether it be the ability or the really strong attack, but the fact that you have to discard all 3 of your energy. So yeah, it would definitely be sad to see the Lati trio go, the Lati duo go, especially as we don't have another Latias EX at the moment. It'd be interesting to see them reprint another Latias EX, or not reprint, but print a new one, just to see whether they'd give it an ability similar to the old one or not.
Yeah, both fairly fringe cards. I guess the attacker has got good thanks to Double Dragon for a little bit, but now it's back to the binder for him. Next up we have Kecleon. This has been always a nice little fringe card. Rarely ever was seen in decks other than Flareon. Back in the day, it was used to counter Mewtwo because you can slap a DC on yourself and then just swing in them. For anyone extending more than 2 energy on their own Mewtwo, this was obviously before Muscle Band. I guess you could put Bangle on the Kecleon. I remember playing it in Flareon and taking a few clutch prizes quite nicely. And most recently, we've seen it to try and be a Rayquaza counter. Also, it can swing against Raichu quite nicely because, of course, it's colorless attacks. And normally you're going to slap either colorless energy or DC onto your Kecleon to fulfill those attack costs. You can, of course, copy Quaking Punch as well. So there were avenues for Kecleon. We've just seen it in the Metal deck most recently. Other than that, I just think those 2 niche situations where Kecleon can be good, it can actually be really good, and it can swing a game, which is kind of cool. It's just a nice little tech option that we've had the option to use every now and again, and he's been nice.
Yeah. Onto the secret rare Pokemon. 2 of them were actually reprinted in Legendary Treasures, but again, we've put them in here just because this is this is the initial set that we're losing them in. First off is Empoleon, the other half of the Empire deck, a third of the Empire deck, I suppose, along with Miltank. Empoleon initially was seen with Dusknoir, and Leafeon usually instead of the Miltanks. Just sort of, again, hitting big numbers for low energy and having built-in draw. Nowadays it's more of an Archie target. Empoleon itself as a deck has seen a lot less play considering Toad is now around, but it's a very good Archie target. That and Swampert are sort of flip-flopped. Sometimes you want a Swampert, sometimes you want an Empoleon. I personally think Empoleon's a little bit better, just because drawing 2 is often better than searching for 1 and not getting it to the next turn, unless you always have outs to be able to get that 1 card. So there's definitely situations where you're going to want one over the other, but Empoleon is, I believe, the better one overall. So yeah, the secret rare Empoleon is rotating with Plasma Freeze.
Yeah, great ability, great attack, all-round good card, great tech in like Night March and Flareon, thanks to Archie. All-round, he's going to be really missed. He's been very useful from the start of his career till the end. Next up, we have Sigilyph, another safeguard Pokemon that we need to talk about. Stopping EX is still really clutch. His attack was never too useful, but he was just going to be something to throw up for these hit and switch cards, make it difficult for your opponent to play around your strategy. And yeah, we're losing pretty much all safeguarders, which is like cool, but also kind of tricky to deal with now. It doesn't really put a check to any of these EXs anymore.
Yeah. Finally, probably one of the most influential cards for a little while, Garbodor. We're actually finally losing Garbotoxin as an ability, locking down all other abilities in the game. Garbodor has seen so much success, whether it be with Yveltal or Toad or Flareon. It's just so good in so many decks. But finally, Garbodor is going rotating out of format. Most recently, it's been in Jason Klaczynski's winning US Nationals lists with Toad. I believe he ran a 2-2.
Yeah.
But abilities are so strong, and Garbotoxin just shut them all off, really hindering your opponent, to be honest. So whilst it's another card that, like Laser, I'm sort of sad to see go, but I'm sort of glad to see go as well. Unfortunately, we still have the Wobbuffet in format, which I can't stand, just because I don't like being locked of abilities. But at least we're getting somewhere with the loss of abilities. At least Garbodor is going. But yeah, it'll be sad to see Garbodor go just because of how successful it's been as a card overall.
Yeah, he's definitely been a titan of the format, pretty much. The only ability locks we have left is, as you say, Jack, the Wobbuffet, and also we're getting Hex Maniac from the new set, which is completely different to Garbodor because you have to be selective about when you want to use it. But Garbodor, definitely a strong card. So let's move on to the trainers now. There's one that we did mention with Keldeo, the obvious combo, and that's Floatstone. Of course, with Keldeo, it was mainly used to free retreat in and out for everything, which is fantastic. Obviously, you use it with Garbodor as well, so that if he's going to be captured up but not killed, you can just move out there. So it's not just going to be sat there until your opponent can take it out. Floatstone really did offer a lot of flexibility to decks that had chunky retreat costs. Just really mitigated all of that, and of course it's like a reusable switch. So fantastic card, used as well for like these hit and switch cards, Trevenant, Wobbuffet, everything like to use these float stones to move in and out of these hit and switched attackers like Donphan and Gengar. So it's going to be a real miss for us. We just have Switch and Escape Rope, and I guess Super Scoop Up can do the job. But Floatstone really was the king if you need to move in between your Pokemon multiple times, and it's going to be a shame to see it move.
Yeah. The first stadium I believe we've talked about so far actually is Frozen City. Frozen City being the plasma-based stadium that would attack. Well, whenever you attached a energy to a non-plasma Pokemon, you put 2 damage counters on it. Not particularly useful. It was never used too much. I believe probably the most recent use for it is forms of Shedinja. I was actually playing Shedinja last night, and mine runs 4 just because it's a good way of getting damage onto your Shedinjas or Mews. But in general, it was never really seen. The main deck it was seen in is TDK, to be honest. And as soon as TDK became less popular, Frozen City also became less popular because Plasma, on the whole, became less popular, and therefore it just meant that the stadium was in general a lot less useful. It was a really good check for things like Inferno Fandango, Emboar, and Deluge, just because all of a sudden you're putting 6 to 8 damage counters on your Pokemon just for attaching energy normally. So that was probably when it was in its heyday, just when Blastoise was big and TDK was also big. It made the TDK matchup well, not an auto win, but such a good matchup because they couldn't go sort of ham with their energy and take huge knockouts. They had to really think about how many damage counters they were placing in order to avoid you knocking them out but still getting efficient knockouts. But nowadays Frozen City's hardly ever seen, in all honesty.
Yeah, I really liked it for rebalancing the Rain Dancers matchup for those plasma decks. I remember in the early days of Speed Lugia, when it first became a thing, I loved playing Frozen City. At least forcing them to find more tropical beaches, see how many they actually play. Because some, obviously, players trying to play Blastoise but on a budget only had like 1 or 2 tropical beach, and they just rely on Scarlet to find it. Frozen City really punished them for that. Next up is Ghetsis. And Ghetsis has really been like Hue in a way, where it's not really seen too much play. Maybe it's been tinkered around with a bit more than Hue, I'll give it that. But it did have a moment in the limelight for UK nationals. Oliver Fenley and Alex Dow both playing it in their winning list. I mean, we can say it's the winning list even though it's first and second because, it's the same list. And it was really fantastic for Toad mirror matches. And it was basically when Trump card was still around, everyone could turbo through their deck. And basically we'd use stuff like Acrobike and Trainer's Mail and Ultra Ball and Shaman to get us through our deck. And Ghetsis basically taking 3, 4, sometimes 5 cards out of your opponent's deck turn 1. Pretty much left them with like an energy in hand and a Pokemon, and they're pretty much stuffed from there. So Ghetsis had its little moment in the spotlight as well. Very, very strong. Again, it's a unique mechanic, and it's going to be an interesting one that we see going.
Yeah. Another supporter, Shadow Triad. A little bit more useful than Ghetsis, often played in Virgin, just to get back G-Booster, just as a one-off. Just so if you got knocked out with the G-Booster attached, you could Triad for the G-Booster. Again, that was its only main real use until Trump Card was banned. Then I believe I saw Jason Glasinski and a couple of other players actually using it in their lists at US Nationals as a sort of pseudo Trump Card, getting back one more laser. Because a lot of the time you were looking for lasers with Trump Card just because of how strong the card was. With the Triad, you didn't. By the time you've got a Toad sort of board set up, you can afford to use these niche supporters like Triad and Ghetsis if you haven't already used it, and then things like Xerosic. But Triad got you that one extra laser, which is just so useful. I think that's the most recent use for it, especially as Virgin's seen a lot less play. It sort of creeped back into play a little bit, but without Triad. I don't know how successful Virgin would have been. It definitely wouldn't have been as G-Booster reliant. But Triad definitely was a very important card for Virgin overall.
Yeah, really important for Virgin, especially when like Tool Scrapper and definitely Megaphone. That was a real hurdle for Virgin. So you definitely had to play at least one Triad in those sorts of decks. Next up is Superior Energy Retrieval. Obviously, it was super clutch for Blastoise and Keldeo and Black Kyurem. It's when that deck really did get really, really strong. I think before Superior Energy Retrieval, people were just playing Blastoise, Keldeo, probably Mewtwo in there as well. But Superior meant that you could Black Ballista, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and close out your game. So it really did fit a huge purpose for these Rain Dancing decks. Very, very strong. Even in Archie Keldeo that we saw again recently in US Nats. Superior was a great card for lowering your hand size for Archies, as well as, of course, getting your energy back to deluge it all back on.
Yeah. On to Plasma Ball, another card that sort of saw some play. Again, TDK was the deck that abused this, really. Just because it searched out pretty much all of your Pokemon, bar the Mr. Mime that a lot of them played. All of a sudden, you had a free Ultra Ball, which was so useful. Another niche card because it only works with Plasmas, but yeah, it would definitely it's definitely good to see all of the Plasma stuff go. But yeah, it's definitely useful in TDK mainly.
Yeah, so on to the A specs of Plasma Freeze, and the first one is Life Dew. Life Dew did serve its purpose in a bunch of different things here and there. When Trump Card was around, it was a real great tool to have for Donphan, because you could try and respam that and basically have a board position where your opponent can't take a prize anywhere on your board, just because you have 4 Robo-Subs and a Donphan with a Life Dew. It really caused havoc for those sorts of decks if you can't handle that. Life Dew as well, very good on Trevenant, because of course people can't just Megaphone or Scrapper it off. It really, again, forces your opponent into awkward plays where they have to take so many prizes before you, I guess, before your opponent takes the win. So Life Dew, pretty strong A-spec. Again, fairly niche, but also when it worked, it really worked well.
Yeah. Probably the least used A-spec of them all, Rock Guard, or one of the least used at least, that wasn't specific to a Pokemon. Rock Guard was basically an overpowered Rocky Helmet. It's seen some play in some decks, but it's never been competitive in my opinion. Especially as it can be, like Joe said, tool scrappered or megaphoned off, or you can, well, if you one-shot them, they're only taking 6 damage. 6 damage isn't all that much, especially with Megas. It's just never really been that good of an A-spec. I feel it's one of the most underwhelming A-specs we've had.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most underwhelming. But it did end up in the top 8 list for US Nats, the Toad Manectric player, for the Toad Mirror match. Because, of course, if you're Quaking Punching, they can't get rid of it. And you hit 30, and they have to Quaking Punch you back, and they're hitting either 30 or 50, but also taking 60 in the process. So either they pretty much lose the Quaking Punch war by not attacking you, or they do, and they pretty much just lose the prize race. So it was a hilarious and creative way of beating the Toad Mirror match, and I really like Rock Guard for that, but it's a shame it took so long for someone to see that combo.
Yeah.
Because I know it wasn't used widely at all. So the last trainer we want to talk about in this set is Max Potion. Max Potion, it's sad to see this one go. It really made Aromatisse, Aromabox, even Gardevoir for a time a very playable deck, being able to heal off everything. Of course, with Aromatisse, it was for free. Other decks like to play it. Stuff like Landorus like to play 1 sometimes just to deny prizes, and then you can just reattach your single energy for the turn. Again, Plasma could sometimes play just 1 for the Thunderous early game. Even Manectric likes to play Max Potion because you can reattach those energies. So Max Potion really was a powerful, powerful trainer card. And it's one that's really going to limit the ability of these sort of healing type decks and just tanking builds. It really just puts a stop to that because we just lose the most powerful means of healing.
Yeah, I think, personally, eventually we're going to get a Max Potion reprint, because It's a card that I believe there was an old form of it. It may not have been Max Potion, it may have been something else, but I believe it's not the first time we've had a card that did this sort of effect. I believe in the next few sets we probably will get a Max Potion reprint. Yeah, I'm really hoping so. I love Max Potion and I love Gardevoir, so I'd really like Max Potion to stay around just because I'd love Gardevoir to eventually work.
It won't.
But
with Rayquaza, that will never work.
But yeah, that's it for Plasma Freeze. That's probably the biggest list of cards. Just because Plasma Freeze, whilst it being a relatively small set, it had again so much influential impact on the format. And then onto the last of the Plasma sets, Plasma Blast. We're going to start with Masquerain, the one that moved tools around. Initially it was used in Tool Drop, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Nowadays the most recent use for it is probably Groudon, just people that were trying to use Spirit Links and Focus Sash or Muscle Band or Hard Charm, just trying to use multiple tools at once. That's probably the most recent use for Masquerain, but people quickly realised that they either have to sacrifice the Spirit Link for a tanky build or sacrifice the tools for a quicker build, and Masquerain never quite fit in the deck overall. It may have seen some success, I don't know, but I don't think the Masquerain build was ever that popular overall.
No, I think when people saw the Wobbuffet as a stronger combo to slow people down, obviously Masquerain has to go in its place. But Masquerain was good in Tool Drop, definitely, because it forced awkward plays. Again, Life Dew was one of the ones Tool Drop could play, and that was a good target for Masquerain to try and move that around whenever you found it. So fun little ability, moving tools, interesting. Never really got too strong, but it's a nice one that we will unfortunately lose. Next up, a huge killer combo, Virizion EX and Genesect EX. Virizion is still relevant today just because of its ability. Blocking laser damage is huge, not being able to sleep or paralyze or anything like that for anything that has a grass energy attached. Even if you're playing it in like a Roma box, those rainbows count for the Virizion. Virizion's still around as one or two ofs in certain decks. But, of course, back in the day, he was the Accelerator, one of the two big cards in the Virgin deck. Accelerating, setting up knockouts for Genesect early on. With a Muscle Band, you could hit 70 for the first Genesect to come in and hit 100 to finish off an EX. And then if they can't respond, you go G-Booster and kill another EX. One of the decks that just, thanks to Red Signal, you could be so efficient for your prizes. Usually you'd go down, let a Virizion die in the process, then you'd hit them with an N and kill whatever's in front of them and then take your 6 prizes from there. Very, very powerful combo. Genesect was huge for the Red Signal. He was even used sometimes as a one-of in Plasma decks just for those extra catches. Also in the Evolutions Plasma build he was used. There was also at one point an Aroma box deck that also used Plasmas. This was when you could still have Prism Energy, so you literally played 3 or 4 Plasma Energy, then the Prisms, then the Rainbows, and just moved all of those around and had one Genesect in there for catching as well. So plenty of avenues for both of these cards just because of their abilities, but their attacks were also something special as well.
Yeah, definitely going to be sad to see both of those cards go just because of how splashable both of them are. Finally for the Safeguarders at least, Suicune is the Plasma Blast Safeguarder. There was sort of another card that was flip-flopped with Sigilyph. Depending on what deck you were playing, you were either going to run 2 or 3 Sigilyph or 2 or 3 Suicune if you were playing a lock deck. Nothing much to say that we haven't said already about the Sigilyph overall. It had a bit of a better attack than the Sigilyph, just because it was a consistent 70. And it's still seen today in Primal Kyogre and Wailord, but it's not. It's a card that we've just got to get used to not having, I guess. Like Joe said, the only other Safeguarder that's strictly the same as these is Beautifly. So yeah, there's both of the the basic Safeguarders, the good Safeguarders at least, are going in this rotation, which is a little bit sad to see.
Yeah, I mean, it spells a lot of bad news, I think, for Primal Kyogre in particular. because it really has nothing to do in the first 2, sometimes 3 turns, and having Keldeo and Suicune, its 2 other partners, go at once is really going to be difficult for that deck to carry on XY on. But we'll see how it adapts, and Suicune, of course, it was around in more than just that deck. So let's move on now to the Drifblim. This was the Drifblim that had the ability that its attacks costed 1 colourless less for each plasma your opponent had in play, and the attack was for 3 colourless energy, 70, and discard a special. This was one of the cards that I love to play in my Flareon build. It was also, I played it with Virgin before, I played it with Balloons, and that, of course, was relevant when plasma cards were relevant. Virizion Genesect, TDK, these were popular, very popular at one time, and Drifblim, combined with the promo Drifblim, which we'll get onto, were a very, very dangerous combo that could sometimes hit for free, if not hitting for just 1 energy, and hitting good damage and stopping your opponent from attacking you the following turn by discarding energy at the same time. So a very, very powerful stage 1 card, and I'm going to really miss these Drifblims because they pretty much carried me to pretty good results when they were first released.
Yeah, they were both very odd cards, but very, very useful cards, especially with all the plasma and stuff around at the time. The Tool Drop pair, Sigalith and Trubbish, are both going in this rotation. Tool Drop was a deck that was relatively successful when it was first released, then it sort of dropped back a bit. It's had a little bit of success since then, but nothing major. But yeah, it's definitely probably one of the most interesting mechanics that's going. It's a bit like, it's not like Night March, but it's an interesting mechanic that we haven't really seen before like Night March. And especially with the Sigalith that could have 4 tools on it, it meant for some really interesting and weird combos of tools that you could have on Sigalith. You could make a really tanky one with 4 Eviolites or 4 Hard Charms, or one that doesn't give up prizes with Life Dew, things like that. It just led to some really interesting combos with Sigalith. And then obviously the Trubbish did huge, huge damage, being able to take out EXs for relatively low cost. And then when sort of Headringer and stuff were released, it further increased how annoying these cards were, but it was never quite consistent enough to always be a top contender at the big tournaments, at least. But it's definitely a sad concept to see go, and I hope we get more of these sort of interesting and new concepts that just happen to be in one set. Like the Plasma Blast set was the Tool Drop set, the Phantom Forces set was sort of the Night March set. I hope we see more of these sort of unique combinations in the future, because I think they make for really interesting and fun decks.
Yeah, they're good, fun budget decks. Definitely like easy combos to see just in black and white. Just like, oh, these two pair together really nicely. And it's especially good for new players. They can just buy a set number of packs from just one set, and they're pretty much ready with a deck if they buy, you know, the right supporters. So it's good to see those sorts of combos in sets, just for the future of the game, really, and getting more people involved. In terms of playability, it pretty much fell off the map when Night March got good, because it was just as budget, just as powerful, if not more powerful, and pretty much more consistent. So we haven't seen much of Trubbish and Sigalith as of late, just because of Night March. They're pretty much the same weaknesses and strengths, but Night March is just more consistent. Next up, we're losing Jirachi EX. Very sad day for all of us. Jirachi, the Ultra Ball that turns into any supporter you want. Really helps consistency in all decks. Obviously, the bane of everyone's existence when you start Jirachi. And obviously, it's a horrible Lysander target. But I think by the end, or definitely in recent times, I think Jirachi's pretty much been used from everyone. Because it's just so important for getting your setup. And if you don't set up, you're just as much in a bad situation as you would be if Jirachi was just Lysandered up anyway at any point in the game. And you may as well just try and set up your board to try and win the game in the first place. So just a really, really powerful card. Its HP was, of course, horrible. Starting with it, horrible. But it just so important to actually set up your board that you had to play this if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, initially I think people were a bit turned off by the low HP and the 2 prizes. But I read an article when I think it was a couple of months after it was first released. Basically, I think it was on 6 prizes, that basically said why Jirachi was so good, and I think it made a lot of people realise that if your opponent's going to be Lysandering your Jirachi for an easy 2 prizes, they're not taking out your attacker, Whereas Jirachi became a lot less of a 2 prize target and more of a sort of game winning target. So in the early turns, if you need a setup, there's no problem with using Jirachi whatsoever, because your opponent's just sort of hindering themselves if they're taking the easy prizes, because all of a sudden they've just left your attacker alone. And it's meant that Jirachi has just sort of helped you set up for absolutely free. They're taking 2 prizes, but you've got a big strong attacker that you can take them out of next turn. So I think a lot of people were turned off by Jirachi initially. Now, if you don't play Shaymin, you play Jirachi, unless you're playing Wobbuffet. But if you don't play Shaymin, you play Jirachi. Sometimes you play Shaymin and Jirachi. I know a lot of decks play both, because just like as a Jirachi is a 1 of, and then Shaymin is a 2 or a 3 of. Just because both are such useful abilities. So yeah, it's definitely sad to see the Jirachi go. And again, I hope we get something similar in the future, just because of how strong the card was. Finally, Pokemon-wise from Plasma Blast, we have Palkia going, the other hit and switcher. The main hit this was the hit and switcher that a lot of people used actually before Donphan, despite Donphan coming out 2 sets earlier. Palkia was used a bit more just because it was immediately good, quote unquote, whereas Donphan had to wait until it got the sort of fighting buffs. Palkia was paired with Trevenant to make quite a devastating combo, and a trainer that I'm going to talk about in a minute made the combo even stronger. And with things like Flight Song, Palkia just became such a strong hit and switcher. It was definitely relevant for the first few months while X and Y was out, but until Donphan became the better of the two, because it did eventually more damage for less prizes. It was a little bit more difficult to set up, but because it was a stage 1, but even with Karina it was debatably as easy, because it had a lower energy requirement as well. So Palkia eventually was phased out by better cards, but Palkia was the initial hit and switcher that we had when Trevenant was first released.
Yeah, it was good for Trevor. It was also good for just Snorlax and Suicune. I remember it just because it was Dragon typing. It was pretty good against dealing with Donphan. Not Donphan, Blastoise, sorry. Because of course you hit into the Black Kyurem for super effective damage. You have, like you say, Flight Song. When we had Muscle Band, that really helped out, and of course Deoxys as well. So plenty of ways to make Palkia 2-shot consistently. You could set it up in a turn with DCE plus Colress Mech. I really like playing Palkia. It was a lot of fun. It did have inconsistency issues, but like you say, just outclassed by Donphan, who can do pretty much the same output for the same amount of time to set him up, basically, and he's just a single prize, so obvious reasons why you would play Donphan over Palkia, but it was good while it lasted. Next, on to the supporters. We have Juniper, finally leaving us. Not to worry, we have Sycamore. Next.
The next pair are Silver Bangle and Silver Mirror. This is the card that made Palkia so strong, because a Trevenant with a Silver Mirror shut down some decks. It definitely shut down TDK, especially when they'd used a lot of their resources to build up a board. You could just drop a Silver Mirror and all of a sudden they can't do anything. So yeah, Mirror was niche, but it definitely saw a lot of play and could sometimes just win you games, because you had to say, do you have a way of being able to deal with the Trevenant with a Silver Mirror, because I'm not going to bench 6 prizes. You have to be able to knock out this Pokemon, and if you can't, then I win the game. Which was definitely an issue for TDK players, and I think that was one of the reasons why TDK began to slip off the map, especially when, not initially because Silver Mirror wasn't really used, but when Trevenant was released, it not only locked their items, but then meant they had to find a way of being able to deal with a Pokemon with Silver Mirror. It just meant that TDK sort of dropped off the map overall. And then Silver Bangle was the more aggressive of the two. Bangle was the, if you're a non-EX, you're going to do more damage to EXs. It was sort of the balance card, and was definitely very, very useful for the 2 sets that it was relevant. But then Muscle Band came out and sort of outclassed it a little bit. A lot of decks that run basic or non-EX attackers will still run 1, but Bangle was sort of outclassed by Muscle Band, because Bangle couldn't be attached to an EX, whereas Muscle Band can. So overall, Bangle sort of again dropped off the map a little bit. It it's still, like I say, it's still relevant to an extent, just because sometimes the extra 10 damage that it doesn't give you over the muscle band is really useful, but overall we still keep muscle band, so it's not a huge loss overall.
Yeah, I think I'd pretty much always play muscle band over it at the moment, unless I was playing Raichu Bats, because that's the only deck where I can see definitely that extra 10 is very helpful in a number of situations. But otherwise, muscle band does the job just as well for the most part. So onto the A specs of this set. G-Booster, obvious for Virgen. Virgen's going, so it's all okay. But basically, G-Booster made that deck the powerhouse that it was, hitting 200 damage when you want to, discarding energy. We have ways of getting that energy back with Colress Mech. You could sometimes play DCE if you played it with like Raichu or another tech that used DCE. To fulfill that G-Booster cost, and of course Energy Switch. If your Virizion was around, or if you had like another Genesect with energy on it, you could turn attach and Energy Switch onto your G-Boost, onto your Genesect, do a double G-Booster turn to pretty much close out those games. So G-Booster really was the thing that made Virgen as good as it was.
Yeah, and then the other main A spec for the set was Scoop Up Cyclone, which sort of went under the radar for the first sort of year of its release. No one really used it, and then all of a sudden, around winter regionals time, a lot of people started putting it in. I know Carl Blake top 8'd with the first main deck that he'd ever used with Scoop Up Cyclone, and that sort of triggered a lot of people to think, to realise that it was a relatively good card, especially with things like Jirachi. Then the Bats were released, and Scoop Up Cyclone was an automatic extra 50 damage, like in the next 2 turns. Then Shaman was released, and Scoop Up Cyclone has just got better and better and better. Whilst it's not as good as Comp Search, it's definitely up there with one of the better A specs. Just because with all of the sort of abilities that you use as you drop a Pokemon down, it can be so versatile. And it can sometimes be as good as a computer search, just because there are some abilities where you draw cards or do damage. It's again got the versatility of a computer search. So if your deck abuses abilities like that, then it's definitely a worthy inclusion overall.
Yeah, it really got strong to the latter end of this season. Like you say, Jirachi helps you draw cards, the Bats as well, it's huge, and the healing aspect. Cyclone was either with Toad or with Landorus, and you can just heal, attach for the turn back onto that guy and free retreat back into it. So it had a lot of good uses. So on to Legendary Treasures now. And the first card we're going to talk about is Fliptini. Fliptini hasn't been played for a while now. I can't remember the last deck I played.
Probably Mega Aggron.
Probably Mega Aggron, and that was never good. So it's not too big of a deal losing Fliptini. I guess Malamar is a card that springs to mind that uses flips for damage, but that's about it really. It was interesting while it lasted, but it's not been around for a while now. Yeah,
another interesting concept that I hope we see to better use at some point, but it, like Joe says, it hasn't really been used since probably Vanillix Vileplume.
That was probably the last
Victini
time, yeah.
was the most successful use for it, just because of how disgustingly locky that deck was. Onto Emboar, the other sort of quote-unquote Rain Dancer in the format. Rain Dancing Fire Energy, or Inferno Fandangoing Fire Energy onto usually Reshirams, but again, back in the days of old, it was seen sometimes with Rayquaza EX, that's the one, Rayquaza, attaching 3 energy and then doing 180. I feel it was the inferior variant compared to Eels. There were definitely pros and cons to both, but Emboar hasn't really been seen since then. It's been thought of. I know a lot of people thought initially that Maxi was going to be fire Pokemon instead of ground Pokemon, so a lot of people thought maybe we're going to get Emboar back in some respects because we're going to be able to Maxi the Emboar and use some of the bigger fire attackers, because fire Pokemon naturally have a relatively high attack cost because they do big damage, but unfortunately it turned out that Maxi was fighting type, and we ended up with things like Machamp instead. So Emboar sort of that was Emboar's last hope in my opinion. And and since then Amber hasn't really been used for the past sort of year or so, but it was definitely good when it was first released, so that's why we've included it on the list, because Reshibor was probably one of the best decks when Black and White was first released, just because of how consistent and strong the deck was at the time.
Yeah, Reshibor was huge, and Reshiram's actually the next card we're going to look into. It's a card that we rarely see at all anymore, but it used to be huge HP, even with Typhlosion Prime way back when.
I loved that deck.
Reshiram was a real big powerhouse, big hitter with a plus power. You could kill anything. So that was really good back in the day. Reshiram just not so anymore. So it's finally time to say goodbye to that card.
Yeah, it will be sorely missed. And then to pair with that, we're also losing Zekrom. Another big...
I love that one.
Another big, at the time, big hitter. ZPST was such a good deck. It was so quick. It was so strong. With the Tornadus that was in Emerging Powers, and then the Pachirisu and Shaman. You just got set up so quickly. And at the time, 120 was a big number. Nowadays, it's not really one-shotting anything at all that isn't a basic or a stage 1. But at the time, it was such a strong deck. And again, like Joe said, with a plus power, it was knocking out opposing Reshirams. Reshiram and Zekrom were two huge powerhouses at the time. ZPST and Reshiflosion were probably two of the best decks when Black and White was first released, and it sort of always flip-flopped between them. There was the speed of ZPST, and then the setup of Reshibor, and Reshiflosion, and it really depended on your playstyle as to which one you wanted to play. Both were so successful, both were so good, and they'll both be sorely missed. They were probably two of my favourite decks when I personally first got into competitively playing, at least, because Heart Gold Soul Silver On was the first competitive format I played in, first full season that I played in, and I repped Reshibor so much, and I know ZPST was around as well, so they'll both be sorely missed from both of us, really.
Yeah, sad to see those go. So next up, let's talk about another little fun deck, and that's the round deck. Seismitoad was reprinted in LTC, and so was Meloetta EX, giving that deck some hope. Unfortunately, the round deck is now finally being put to bed. It never really got too good, but it was something fun that could hit big damage. And with Skyfield, it could actually hit huge damage, but it was just as bad.
Probably one of the biggest cards from Legendary Treasures is actually Mewtwo EX. We're finally using the grandfather of the format. It feels like Mewtwo EX has been around forever. And whilst we're technically getting a pseudo reprint from Lugia, Mewtwo was always the original Pokemon that sort of everyone thought was overpowered, and if you didn't have a Mewtwo, you weren't going to do well at a tournament. It was such a strong card. Mewtwo's beat Mewtwo's. There was Mewtwo Wars. There was Mewtwo's everywhere. Nowadays, Mewtwo seems not underwhelming, but not overwhelming as it once did. But it's definitely going to be sad to see Mewtwo go, just because of how important the card was in the evolution of the format overall.
Yeah, everyone's just running one or two energy attackers at the moment just to keep up with the speed of the format, and obviously that doesn't fare well for Mewtwo. The only time I see Mewtwo being played at all anymore is in metal decks as a one-off, because you can charge up huge numbers and still swing through big stuff. So, also, I guess he's sometimes played in Seismitoad to help you with Groudon, but that's about it, really. Next up, a quick mention for Emolga. This is just the basic Emolga, 70 HP, that can call for family for 2 Pokemon. The only reason why I want to mention this card is because it's a free retreating basic, and with this gone and the free flight Zubat gone, I think the only one we have in format right now as a basic free retreater is Hawlucha. And that's something I think needs to be addressed really soon in the card game. Having no free retreating basics is pretty crazy. We're going to have to play high counts of Switch for the next few months in all of our decks just to get into our good attackers for the most part.
Yeah. Another thing that Emolga was used for back when Garchomp was relatively relevant, and a couple of cards that we have missed, the Flight Song Altaria and the old Garchomp are both being reprinted. I can't remember for the life of me which, both being rotated, sorry. I can't remember which set they were printed as secret rares in. It was probably Plasma
Freeze
Storm.
for the Garchomp. Plasma Freeze for the Garchomp, Plasma Storm for the Altaria, I think.
That's the knowledge that I don't have. But yeah, we're losing both of those as well. Just a quick side mention, because they were both, when first released in Dragons Exalted, Garchomp was such a strong card. Losing the little Garchomp, losing the Gabite meant the deck didn't fare well pretty much thereafter, but definitely both influential cards. And we touched on Flight Song and Altaria's use a little bit earlier on with Palkia. So definitely two more cards that will be missed on my part, at least, just because, again, when they were first released, they were so influential. A lot of people either played Hydreigon decks or played Garchomp decks, and yeah, they were both really good cards.
Yeah, so next up, let's mention Gothitelle. Pretty much overall outclassed right now by Trevor. But back in the day, Gothitelle Selgor, really good stuff. Even Gothitelle on his own as an attacker was once seen, just because at the time he had high HP. So yeah, it's a pretty good trainer locking card when it was in the active position. We have Trevor now, so nothing's going to be too missed there.
Yeah. Onto Spiritomb. Spiritomb was one of the cards that really checked Virizion Genesect. Just not letting your opponent play Ace-Spec, well, not letting anyone play Ace-Spec. You usually use your Ace-Spec and then go hunting for your Spiritomb, lock them out of playing their G-Booster, so they'd have to waste time taking out the Spiritomb rather than your attacker, if they wanted to be able to have huge G-Booster turns. Yeah, Spiritomb was definitely a really good check for the G-Booster in Virgin, and in general it was just a really good card, especially if you got to use your Ace-Spec before you got the Spiritomb down. Just because you're just hindering your opponent, you're not hindering yourself in any way at all, because you've already used your Ace-Spec. But yeah, there's a little side mention for that, just because Spiritomb's not really seen anymore. It was probably used most in, any deck that struggled with Virgin in general probably popped one in, just because it was a relatively decent check. It was probably one of the best checks we had, but not really seen anymore, just because Virgin's lost so much popularity.
Yeah, it was a good 61st card in a few decks for anything that had a slightly rocky Virgin matchup. I remember playing it in Mega Manectric, so that they can't one-hit you, even because, of course, they would have Deoxys in play to try and hit that 210. And also, every now and again, I'd throw it in early versions of Landorus before the bats, where you could just beat them anyway with damage, when it was kind of painful for you to get G-boosted. So Spiritomb was a good check there. Next up, let's talk about Chandelure. This was, again, a card early on paired with bats, just because of its psychic typing and its potential to spread damage. Never really got too strong, Chandelure. It had two fairly okay attacks, I guess. The 70 damage for 2 energy if you have the Dimension Valley in play is quite good for the confusion and I think it was poison or burn, one of those.
I think it was burn,
things.
Yeah.
Kind of underwhelming, but it was a nice EX to see, and every now and again people tried to splash it in certain things. Like, I remember when Zubat was getting crazy popular, I saw a few people playing Chandelure just so that you can put the full counters on Zubats to stop your opponent sort of getting theirs out. So every now and then it would crop up, but rarely ever too good.
Yeah. The other grandfather of the set and format overall, Darkrai. We're also using Darkrai. A card that has seen less and less popularity over time, just because Dark has sort of phased out a little bit at the moment. I think it will be back relatively soon. But Darkrai itself, when initially released, was so strong with Junk Hunt Sableye. Darkrai was probably the deck to beat. If you couldn't beat Darkrai, then you really had to reconsider how you were building your deck and whether you had to look for other ways of playing your deck. It was then used less and less as an attacker and more as a supporting Pokemon, with giving free retreat to anything with Darks. Any box-type deck that ran Prisms or Rainbows or Blends, anything like that, probably ran a Darkrai just to give everything free retreat. And you had the ability to take a 90-30 snipe on with Darkrai, but it was never an amazing card as of late. It definitely peaked when it was first released, and is now used much more as a support Pokemon. But yeah, along with Mewtwo, it'll be sad to see two of what feel like the oldest cards in the format to finally leave, ready for X on my arm.
Yeah, I probably think Darkrai, like over the course of averages, probably has won the most tournaments of any card ever. Even just featuring as like a one-off for free retreat, I feel like Darkrai is probably like the best card we've ever seen in our lifetime. Well, I guess Pokemon's lifetime. So yeah, next up, Non-EX Cobalion. Not quite as clutch as Darkrai. It was seen here and there in metal decks. It was seen again in the Six Corners deck that I somehow keep mentioning just because it was a thing back in the day that I liked to play. Um, yeah, Cobalion had decent attacks. Ironbreaker was pesky to get around sometimes. I guess when Keldeo came out, it became less of a sort of locking aspect. But he could sometimes be seen as a tech in, again, metal decks. I don't think he's been seen too much, though, so Heatran pretty much outclasses him as the non-EX metal attacker just because his output's better.
Yeah, I mean, I really like Cobalion. I like Cobalion as much as Heatran. I've always felt Cobalion is a strong card, but it's just, again, another card that's phased out a little bit. And a card that hasn't phased out, though, Mew, is probably one of the biggest, well, with the biggest losses that we're having in Legendary Treasures, just because of how reliant some decks are on it. Night March is still viable, but Mew helped the deck so much when it was first released. Nowadays, Night March plays less Mew, 2 or 3 is usually the average count, but Mew is definitely strong. And it's just such a versatile card. Mew is always so versatile. Its ability is called Versatile, there you go. So yeah, it's definitely sad to see Mew go, because it just gave so much more creativity to some decks. No doubt the next Mew, competitive Mew we have, will have some similar way of doing it, being able to use all attacks or certain attacks of Pokemon in the discard, something like that. But for now, we don't have a Mew that can do basically whatever it wants on the board. So yeah, Mew will be missed.
Yeah, I think Mew is like crazy good. Like definitely for Night March, just because it means now Night March probably has to play like 3 or 4 revive because they have to have the Pokemon in the discard pile, otherwise they're not doing enough damage. But another huge thing for Mew was you could copy Quaking Punch until you're ready to actually doing big damage, so the Toad player doesn't just storm ahead of you. And Night March not having that option anymore is going to really hurt them. But Mew was seen in loads of other things as well. It was tinkered around with for Virgin as well when people were saying that was too slow. You could play Dimension Valley Mew with just 1 grass energy. You could do the Emerald Slash, which is pretty cool as well. So just that ability with the fact that you have Dimension Valley, you could just make attacks so cheap and get going really quickly with that card. So I think that's it other than promos, but there is probably still the biggest card we need to discuss, and that is going to be N. N completely reshapes the game right now, and I think it's going to be a completely different card game. Even though we're getting the Ace Trainer card, think about ending someone to 3. They're normally, with the top deck as well, getting 4 cards. They're going to have an out for the most part. Like, it's not the same as ending someone to 1. And that Ace Trainer as well, it's just so much, it's not going to be used as much as N at all. Not only because it can only be used when your opponent is ahead of prizes than you, but also because people are only going to play like 1 of it, if any, because it's just not as usable as N was. And N was a card that I really liked it because it was a good card for setup decks, getting you back into the game. It did add an element of, ooh, do I need to play these cards? Do I need to hold the resources for later? What's my opponent's hand? Sort of think what he's going to do next turn, all that stuff. It did bring an extra skill into the game in a huge sense. And it was another card that could punish these speed decks and really keep them in check. And it's going to be interesting to see how that affects the format going into XY on. Potentially, there's no real drawback for being speed deck right now.
Yeah, I mean, I believe Pokemon's intentions, from what I've been reading, N initially was designed as a disruption card, which it definitely was, but a lot of people used it more as just a draw card. And I think if we had something like Professor X New Theory in the format as well, I think it would have been used as much more of a disruption card rather than a draw card, because Pont would have always got you 6, whereas N sort of may have put you down less cards, but it may have also given your opponent less cards. I think the problem was that Pokemon never really followed up N with another good draw supporter, at least for a few sets. which meant N became a lot less disruption and a lot more draw, and thus having a standard 4 Juniper 4 N support account in pretty much all decks for 2 years running. Now we have less so because we have so much more trainer draw support. But for the first 2 or 3 years that N was released, 4N and 4 Juniper was no surprise in pretty much all deck lists, just because of how consistent it made the deck. As far as other promos go, we also lose the Ninetales, the Bright Look Ninetales, which dipped in and out of play. Sometimes was played with lasers, sometimes was played as a sort of tech card with the new Ninetales. Again, just being able to catch it without using your supporter. It was good when catcher wasn't errated and was still as good as it used to be, because you technically had 3 or 4 catchers and then 3 or 4 Ninetales, and you were doing sort of 120 for 1 energy. All of a sudden, you really controlled your opponent's board so much, because they couldn't promote anything with less than 120 HP. And if they did, you could just catch up something with 120 HP, because you had so many outs to choosing what you took the knockouts on. So yeah, Ninetales is definitely another sort of big card that never quite made it, but was definitely really influential when it was first released, especially with things like a Moongus and stuff like that.
Yeah, I always think it was kind of too inconsistent to be a good attacker, but I think that Bright Look, being a searchable catcher, especially when catcher got changed, only having Lysander as our option, that Bright Look is just so strong. So the final promo is Drifblim. We have mentioned it, combined with the other one. This Drifblim could do Shadow Steel for 50 times the amount of special energy in your opponent's discard pile for just 1 colorless energy. Dimension Valley made that free, but back in the day, you'd normally use it with like 1 or 2 Enhanced Hammer normally, and then wait for the mid to late game when you've already taken out a few of their attackers. So there's potentially 3 or 4 energy in their discard pile. Either slap a Bangle or a Muscle Band on, and you're hitting, knockouts on even EX Pokemon for 1 energy, and that's pretty good, I'd say. It was used in Flareon for a small amount of time. It was used as a tech in other decks. I remember using it in Landorus, Lucario before the bats were out, to help you with Donphan and stuff like that, and that did bring me to a top 8. So definitely Drifblim has been very good throughout. Seeing as though special energy is always good, I'm surprised we've not actually seen much more of that card, because it's a very decent, fairly splashable and cheap attacker that can really punish decks using special energy. I guess Trump card was the thing that made it not useful anymore, but I'm surprised to see that it maybe doesn't even feature in Worlds at all. I'd actually quite like to see it come back in Worlds now that Trump card's gone. Potentially a niche that people haven't seen yet.
Yeah, but that's it. That's all of the cards, all of the influential cards that we believe are leaving the format this September. There's probably 1 or 2 that we've missed. Please comment if there is anything. But yeah, that's about an hour and a half of information thrown at you all. Just letting you know how big this rotation is. It's going to be game changing. One of the most game changing in the past few years, just simply because we're losing N more than anything. Like Joe said, we have no real draw support other than N at the moment that's consistent and always good, or always disruptive. If it's not getting you a lot of cards, it's disrupting your opponent. But yeah, that's. I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Are you still here?
Are you still here? Congratulations!
Well done.
You made it all the way through.
You must really like our videos.
But yeah, bar that, nothing really much else to say. We'll be doing a Worlds analysis in the next couple of weeks, just when the format sort of settled down a bit. A lot of people are still up in arms a little bit about after US Nationals, still working out what's good, what's not as good anymore. But we'll definitely be bringing you a Worlds analysis, and then Ancient Origins Next Way On begins. It's not long from now. I'm going to a pre-release 2 weeks tomorrow. Sorry. So I'm
2 weeks tomorrow as well.
So it's really not long at all until we have these new cards and we're playing with them. So yeah, make sure you stick around for those. We're going to be updating you with loads of different deck lists with us It's a small set, but there's a lot of new combinations that we can use. But yeah, thank you so much for watching if you've made it this far. I think we're about an hour and a half. You'll be able to see just below us. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack, and here's been Joe from Omnipoke, and we will hopefully see you in another video.